Mr. Chairman, would you like me to take roll?
We're going to go ahead and bring the meeting to order. And yes, please take roll.
Okay, Representative Brown,
Present.
Representative Campbell,
Here.
Representative Lean,
Here.
Representative Lucas. Representative Riggins excused, Representative Storer,
Here.
Representative Stivar,
Excused.
Representative Worf,
Here.
and Chairman Locke.
Present.
We have a quorum, Mr. Chairman.
Very good. So I'm going to go over just a few things today, and we won't spend a lot of time with the quorum since pretty much everybody in this room is spending here more times than they care to think about. And thank you all for coming. This is going to be a little bit. I have to speak on a bill in the next room. They're going to be coming for me anytime, so I'll apologize up front for the fact we'll have to. I believe Vice Chair Stivar should be here any second, but so I'll run the meeting until I have to go speak on the other bill, and then I'll hand it over. That being said, we're going to make a minor change to our order here on bills. We're going to do House Bill 113 first, 124 second. We're going to do House Bill 104 third, and then 311 we will push to the last, okay? And then we will resume on adjournment if for some reason we don't get those four done, but hopefully none of those are too complex. That being said, let's move ahead with House Bill 113. And Representative Smith, please proceed, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee. Good morning. I am here to present House Bill 113, which is an act relating to taxation and revenue, exempting insurance damage settlement payments from sales and use taxation, and providing for an effective date. In essence, what this does is if you have an automobile accident, you get an insurance payout, you're able to retain your depreciated value of your vehicle and not pay double tax on the part of your insurance settlement. And so that way, similarly, as it already stands in statute on page 2, line A, you already don't pay sales tax on trade-in value. So this is just kind of helping keeping a fair and level playing field and beneficial to people who buy a brand new truck and a month later total it out, not paying sales tax on that same vehicle twice. So I do have Representative Alan Schlegel on standby here, and he probably has a few things to say as well.
Representative Slagle, or
Well,
I guess
thank you.
ex-Representative Slagle. So sorry, Alan.
Yeah, as I was going to say, I'm not a representative anymore, but this was a constituent bill that I'd brought when I was in legislature last year. And what it was is I'd had a constituent that had been in a car accident. They'd been run into by a gentleman that totaled their vehicle, and his actually ended up killing himself. But after they got out of the hospital, they bought a new vehicle and went to the treasurer's office to pay their tax, and and they got taxed on the whole deal. And he's like, he questioned them on it, and then called me. And so I had visited with the revenue department about it. What the situation is the revenue department looks at this as two transactions: the transaction of you getting the insurance payment, and then the transaction of you getting a new vehicle. So it's not one transaction like when you go to a dealership and trade in your old vehicle for a new one. They consider that just one transaction. And so that's why the revenue department wanted to tax it as they do right now. And so I brought this bill because in my mind, most of the time when we have an accident, it's not our choice to have that accident. And we haven't, the insurance is a requirement. We have to have at least liability. If we have full coverage, so we get a payment, that's an agreement between us and the insurance company that if we do have an accident, they will at least pay a portion of what our vehicle is worth. And so I felt where it gets taxed when you get an insurance payment, it's just taxing the money that we've already paid tax on a second time. And I didn't think that was really fair to our constituents, especially the constituent in my case. They were senior citizens and were on a fixed income, and the tax was like $1,500. And so that was a significant portion of what they were having to live on for the year. So anyway, I would stand for any questions if you have any.
Representative Lean, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for joining us today. My curiosity runs in how would the burden of proof be that this was an insurance payment?
Mr. Slagle.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess what I would say is, most of the time when you get an insurance payment, that can be noted when the sale is transacted. Be similar to a trade-in, because when you take your sales deal in with a trade-in, you aren't taxed on that, and so it could be noted the same way. I would think.
Follow-up question? Other questions? Yes. Representative Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Slagle, pleasure to see you as always. So when the insurance company pays for the damages on the vehicle, so it's a full coverage plan and the car is totaled, typically there's a loan there, and the first duty of the insurance is to pay off the loan. So the money would go directly to the lender. Yeah, I'm kind of following up, I guess, on Representative Lean's question, because there's going to be a paper trail, I suppose, that's going to have to be presented for this, because the dealer won't see that part at all.
Mr. Slagle or?
That's a weird question.
Or Mr. Smith?
There's a question in
Representative
there.
Smith.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that is true. There would have to be a paper trail there. It's and I think if you see in the bill, it has to be done in 90 days. So it isn't like something that can carry on for a long extended period of time. So it's not going to be so vague in people's memory that they can't keep track of that paper trail. And I think the kind of going on a bit different subject, is talking about being a second transaction. The reason I feel it's not a second transaction is when the insurance company supposedly buys your vehicle back from you, they pay no sales tax on it like we do when we would sell that vehicle to another individual. And so in that, it kind of, in my mind at least anyway, it doesn't make it a second transaction.
Other questions for Representative Smith or Mr. Slagle? So I'm just gonna ask a question of you, and do you guys have a clear picture in your mind what the paper trail is at all? Do you know what this looks like? Honestly, I'm not experienced in this area, so do you have a feel for the paper trail that can be used is question.
Mr. Chair.
Yes. Mr. Slagle.
Mr. Chair, I really think the paper trail is if you receive a check from an insurance company, a receipt from that check or a photocopy of that check would be a sufficient paper trail if it's shown that amount is the same with your receipt at the car dealership, possibly.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Slagle. All right. Any other questions for the presenter or Mr. Slagle? Okay, and I assume, Mr. Slagle, you'll stay online, right?
Yes, I will.
Okay, thank you. All right. Thank you. Representative Smith, and I guess the department if we could. Thank you. Thank you for being here today. I appreciate it.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, Brett Fanning, Excise Tax Administrator at the Wyoming Department of Revenue. And I think I can help clear up at least part of the questions that were asked. When you take a look at this bill, and just a little bit of backstory. So I am familiar with this concept because former Representative Slagle did reach out to the department and outlined exactly, as he'd mentioned, how can we make this kind of work in statute, just the idea, and then how to put the language actually in the bill. So if you do take a look at page 2, lines 19 through 23, and then carrying over to page 3, the department in collaboration with our county treasurers, it's an important piece here because our county treasurers collect our sales tax on motor vehicles, and then the Department of Revenue is the administrative agency for sales tax on those same motor vehicles. So it's really a collaboration. Rarely a day goes by where I am not in correspondence with a county treasurer or members of their staff. So the burden of proof piece, kind of that documentation, when we take a look at this bill, so on page 3, trailer or semi-trailer was acquired by an insurance company pursuant to a damage settlement. That's kind of this documentation piece where as when you go into the county treasurer, pay sales tax on your motor vehicle, there's got to be this documentation that the insurance company has purchased your vehicle or taken possession of it. That's that first documentation piece. So it's going to be a piece of paper or statement from the insurance company saying, hey, we took possession of this vehicle, we purchased it. That's kind of the first point of the documentation. Then the second point of the documentation is, then that insurance payment is used not more than 90 days after receiving the insurance payment. So here's another piece of documentation where you've got to have, maybe it's a check stub, check payment that says, hey, here's the amount of the damage settlement, and then the date on the check saying that it falls in line with this 90-day period. So the department sees that there is an update in our rules that could be made to clarify this for our county treasurers, for the purchasers, saying, hey, there's kind of this two-part test in addition to the other documentation that you need with the motor vehicle bill of sale, kind of those items. So when you go and purchase a motor vehicle, you've really got 65 days from the date you purchase it to go into the county treasurer and do the back and forth and the hauls between the county clerk and the county treasurer. So the 90 days in this bill takes some time for that insurance documentation, settlement to kind of work its way out. So you've got 90 days once you get that payment. Then you go and purchase a new motor vehicle and you've got kind of this 65 days to actually go in there and pay your sales tax. So that was my recollection of the 90 days was it takes a little bit of time for this insurance stuff to come through. And then you've got time between the 90 days of getting the payment and then the 65 days and actually paying the sales tax on the motor vehicle. So that was kind of the burden of proof along with those additional items. Mr. Chairman, so how do the loans work in this process? Yes, so when your car gets totaled, gets damaged, you get in an accident, heaven forbid, or there's a big hailstorm in Cheyenne that tends to happen, usually any of the loans are going to be satisfied, paid off, and then what's remaining is going to go back to the actual motor vehicle purchaser. It is our belief, based on how this bill is written, that any of that net is what can then be used as the trade-in for the new vehicle. Right now, county treasurers and the department are familiar with how that trade-in language works. It reduces the sales price, just like we've talked. The intent behind this bill is also to reduce that sales tax as well. So the net on all of the administrative items with this bill. Insurance companies, as former Representative Slagle mentioned, they can take possession of motor vehicles without possession of sales tax. It's not technically in our exemption statutes, but it is a provision in our sales tax statutes. So they do not pay tax on that. So the statement made by former Representative Slagle is accurate. Insurance companies don't pay sales tax when they acquire the motor vehicles. With that, Mr. Chairman, again, partnership with county treasurers, but I do believe the rest of this is pretty straightforward. It's to reduce the taxable price on a motor vehicle if your car gets totaled or is part of the damage settlement. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd stand for any questions.
Questions for Mr. Fanning? Representative Wharf.
I just have a question, because I don't have my documentation with me, but I don't recall, I just went through an experience where my house, I got the pleasure of having the city sewer back up and flood my house. And I know I did get a settlement check from my insurance company, but I don't remember paying tax on that. Is that taxable? Or are motor vehicles just treated differently, Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Fanning.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Representative Wharf, not sales taxable in Wyoming. Nope, completely different. So in previous testimony, sales tax in Wyoming is really based on retail sale or service to tangible personal property. So them coming to do work on your sewer backup is not included in our imposition statutes.
Thank you. Any other questions for Mr. Fanning? Representative Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to clarify, Mr. Fanning, so my experience is a lot of times there isn't a residual amount of money from the insurance company that a lot of times the insurance settlement doesn't pay the loan off. But the amount that was paid, the covered amount, then is that the part that would not be taxed, sales taxed?
Mr. Fanning.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Lucas, yes, ma'am. Based on the way we read this, it is the amount of money that the individual got as part of that damage settlement.
That would not be taxed.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, would not be taxed.
Thank you, Mr. Fanning. Other questions for Mr. Fanning? As always, thank you for the detail and bringing that forward. Now, one question I do have, just from your perspective, this process is well understood and can be tracked and rules put in place by the department to where this is workable. Let me ask that question, Mr. Fanning.
Mr. Chairman, the answer is yes. The county treasurers and the department are familiar with this process because we do it every single day with trade-ins. This additional paperwork for this damage settlement is going to be new to everyone. But the answer is yes, we feel that it could be administered currently as written.
Thank you, Mr. Fanning. Appreciate that. That's very helpful. If no other questions, okay, who's all's here to speak on this bill? Welcome. Oh, we got one. Great. Perfect.
Mr. Chairman, Bill
Mr.
Winnie,
Winnie.
Sublette County. I've had 3 vehicles that have been proposed to be totaled by my insurance company, and in each case, I didn't accept that, and they paid me for repairs. One of those vehicles was a 25-year-old GMC Suburban, so it was real easy to propose totaling that thing, but it was still workable. Did the repairs, got a check, off down the road. But it strikes me, there was a question here about the paper trail. It strikes me the paper trail that you're interested in would be taking the license plates and so on out of service on the one vehicle if you do total it, and then the other side when you replace it with another vehicle. And so I would think that would provide you plenty of information. Subject to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Winnie. Any questions for Mr. Winnie?
Good morning, Mr.
Good morning.
Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Bill Novotny, Johnson County Commissioner here on behalf of the Wyoming County Commissioners Association. Unfortunately, we have to share our opposition to this bill. This is yet another attempt to erode the ability of your local government to pay for the most basic and essential services. In this instance, this bill doesn't have a huge fiscal note to it, but this, in the totality of the other cuts and reductions that you're making to your local government, it's going to inhibit our ability to provide the most basic services, whether it's law enforcement, quality roads, so that your vehicle doesn't get totaled because it's not snow plowed, or that there's a giant pothole that rips the front tire off of your vehicle. So I just would caution you that this, compounded with other bills that are making their way through the process, really are inhibiting your ability of your local government to use these very dollars. These are consumption dollars that then can be reinvested in your community to pay for the most basic and essential services. And with that, Mr. Question, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Questions for Mr. Novotny? Oh, sorry, Representative Storer, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr.
Looked right
Chairman.
past you.
Good morning, Mr. Novotny. Good to see you. I'm still just trying to wrap my head around this a little bit. This is a sales tax that the insurance industry is paying. And it reduces their required indemnity payments, but that's not really double taxation in my mind. So I'm not quite sure why this is important. But I understand why it's important to you. So I'm just trying to understand the value of the bill.
Mr. Novotny.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Storer, that is a very valid question. I can't answer it, and I think that's one that really is better focused on the bringers of the bill. But the bottom line, if you're really wanting to bring tax relief to individuals or allow them to have more in their pockets, this probably isn't the best way to bring broad relief to individuals. This is a very niche, but unfortunately, it's a niche that digs into your local government.
Yes, Representative Storer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I think I've lost track of the different bills that are impacting local government's ability to raise revenues. Do you have a good sense of the enormity of that at this point in time in the session?
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Novotny.
Representative Storer, we are tracking at least 10 to 12 variations of property tax relief. Then when you get into the sales tax relief, whether it's on electricity, services, which thankfully was defeated, firearms, just a broad, at least 6, 7 in that realm of that are going after specific portions of the sales tax code and what's exempted and what's not. So in totality, it's a large hit to your local government.
Any other questions for Mr. Novotny? Great, thank you. Anyone
Thank
else?
you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Novotny. Sorry about that. Thank you for your coming up. Now, do we have anybody online for this one? We do. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Is it Lindsay West?
Yes, Mr.
Very
Chairman,
good.
I'm admitting Lindsay West.
Right, so.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Can you hear us okay?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Very
Mr.
good.
Chairman,
Okay. Can you actually put your camera on too? Is that acceptable for you or?
let's see. All right.
There we go. Perfect. Thank you for joining the meeting. Please introduce yourself and proceed.
All right. Good morning, Chairman Locke and committee. My name today representing the Wyoming County Treasurers Association. County treasurers are responsible for collecting sales and use tax on most items in the motor vehicle realm. However, sales tax collection on some items like motorcycles, ATVs, and dirt bikes are left to the vendors that sell them. And so under the broad definition of motor vehicles that this bill uses, the onus of administering this exemption will not only be on county treasurers, but also the vendors that sell those items not expressly stated to be collected by us. So while testimony received today from our group may be important to the committee, it may also be worthwhile to hear from the dealers that would also be impacted by this. Under this bill, the taxpayer would need to know that the exemption exists for it to be used. There will likely be nothing on any of the dealership paperwork or bill of sale in instances of person-to-person sales that would indicate to us that an insurance settlement is being used. And none of the current processes that we use for detecting exemptions would be employed in the identification of this particular exemption. Our offices would also require proof that the insurance company actually acquired the vehicle via a damage settlement to ensure the payment is being used, that it's not being used for something like a salvage settlement or a manufacturer buyback instead. The burden of proof for this, as far as we understand this bill, would come from the settlement paperwork itself, with language that the actual acquisition back to the insurance company was present, especially in instances where there's not a title that has been transferred to the insurance company. Our offices would also require proof of when the insurance settlement payment was received by the insured, and then we'd need to compare that to the date of purchase of the newly acquired vehicle to ensure that period between those two occurrences was not more than that 90 days. And so this goes back to the burden of proof question already posed. What would we use to establish the date of payment when it was received? Would we use the date on the settlement check and proof of the same? Or would we use the date of deposit of that check, which would require us to potentially look at bank statements of taxpayers? I think this question would need answered to ensure we're applying the exemption in a uniform manner statewide. I bring these items up for the committee's awareness just to demonstrate what our staff would be required to ask for in these scenarios, what details we would have to parse out to identify that the settlements were solely related to that of damage and not of defect under a lemon law or under salvage if the insured decided to maintain possession of that vehicle. And so these are just questions that we feel would need to be addressed. It is the belief that county treasurers feel that the administrative part of this bill would be extremely difficult for our offices. We certainly understand its intent, but we also fear that by not having the exemption streamlined into the insurance process itself, the exemption may be missed in instances where the taxpayer is unaware that it exists, or because of the time and proof constraints that this bill entails. And so that, with that, Mr. Chairman, I would conclude my testimony, but I would be happy to stand for any questions.
Questions for Ms. West? Excuse me, I have a question. Are the items that you mentioned something that would normally be rules that would be coordinated and provided in coordination with the DOR, Department of Revenue, sorry?
Chairman Locke, we look to the staff at Department of Revenue, specifically excise tax in this instance, often for promulgation of rules. So we would, I guess, look to DOR for guidance on that.
Thank you. Any other questions? Oh, Representative Lean, please.
Thank you for appearing today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for appearing today. Could you repeat the list that you said at the beginning? There was motorcycles, ATVs, people that are the vendor collecting the tax?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Lean. So currently, items such as motorcycles, ATVs, and dirt bikes are left for the vendor to collect sales tax on. And so when you use that broad term of motor vehicle, it could be understood that that would be inclusive of the items that vendors are also selling in the state of Wyoming.
Any other questions? Representative Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ms. West, for being with us today. I appreciate your information. This also could include private party sellers, could it not?
Chairman Locke, Representative Lucas, there's nothing from our interpretation of how the bill is written that would specifically exclude private sales.
Other questions? Okay, thank you, Ms. West. Really, we appreciate you being here. Thank you.
For having me.
Okay, anyone else online, anything? Anyone else in the room? Okay, so on House Bill 113, I think I'm on the right bill, we will close public comment. Committee, what's your pleasure? Yes, Representative Lucas, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I spent a lot of time over the years working in credit unions and banks, and I've done a mighty number of car loans over those years, and many times for folks who have had their vehicles totaled. And I've had a few totaled myself, Hale in Wyoming. It works. The last two that I had totaled, I did buy dealer cars, and the amount of sales tax, I just calculated it out, that I paid on the insurance settlement was $720 and $900. So it's a significant amount of money for our taxpayers. I see, though, that this could be a little complex for the dealer wouldn't know any of this, as prior testimony has said. The lender would, because the lender is the holder of the title. And many times when the insurance settles, they settle for less than the loan value. So the borrower, the car owner, ends up owing money to the bank after the insurance has paid. And so the title is released to the insurance company, but there's still a debt owed. And so this, a lot of times, is a very extreme amount, a burden, a financial burden for the car owner. They didn't look for this to happen, and so they're hit with having to pay off a loan where they don't have a vehicle because the insurance didn't pay for all of it, and that is typically the situation. And then to have to pay sales tax on the amount that the insurance company paid off on their car, you know, that's a bit of a bite. So I just wanted to point this out. This would be an extreme help to folks in those situations. I'm for this bill.
So let's get back to what's your pleasure on the bill then?
Move the bill.
Moved by Vice Chair Stivar and seconded by Representative Brown. Okay, so now we can start with amendments. Let's go ahead and do that. Any amendments to the bill that you guys would propose, that the committee would propose? Let's start with page 2 is the first change. Any amendments? And I think we'll move to page 2 and 3 really is the first opportunity there. The next, and I would say last opportunity here is page 4, or at the bottom, or halfway down. Any amendments? Seeing none, any discussion, any further discussion on the bill? Okay, question's been called. Please call roll. Donna.
This is a roll call vote on House Bill 113, insurance payments not taxable. Representative Brown?
Aye.
Representative Campbell?
Aye.
Representative Lean?
No.
Representative Lucas?
Aye.
Representative Riggins excused. Representative Storer?
No.
Representative Stivar?
Aye.
Representative Wharf?
No.
Chairman Locke?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, we have 5 aye, 3 no, and 1 excused.
Okay. House Bill 113 has passed the committee. All right. And we will move on to House Bill 124, Reduction in Taxation Act, and Representative Filer. Welcome to the Revenue Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes,
And,
sir.
Feels good to be back. I tell you, I think the legislature tried to kill me, but I prevailed.
Well, welcome back. I was a little worried. I knew you were on the list and not feeling well, but
Yeah.
thank you for making it, and hopefully this didn't push you too much, but
Well, and my doctor did tell me yesterday, Mr. Chairman, that I'm not contagious anymore, so, stuff like that.
great.
But anyway, Mr. Chairman, I bring you guys House Bill 124, the Reduction in Taxation Act, short-term beer tax. It's probably a good old friend of this legislature for quite a few times to possibly do a repeal on malt beverages here in Wyoming. Just a little bit about the background of the bill. I think one of the main reasons why I brought it to the legislature this year is there's one of my constituents deals in a microbrewery. And a lot of the administrative costs that gets burdened on to the microbreweries to literally send a check for $2 or $3. They got to do 12 different reports every year. It takes a lot of administrative staff for the money that we actually generate from it. It's just a very big burdensome on small business. We don't really generate very much money from the malt beverage taxes. We know it's never even increased since Prohibition. But anyway, Mr. Chairman, that's the most of the bill is just pretty much going through everything, the collection of it, just repeals any of the malt beverages, the taxes that shall not be assessed on malt beverages. That's pretty much the summary of the bill of what it does. Mr. Chairman, I'll stand for any questions if anybody has any questions, but that's pretty much the gist of it. We're not repealing liquor taxes or anything like that. This is strictly malt beverage.
Any questions for Representative Filer? Okay. Thank you for that, and I'm sure you'll be handy, but will anybody else want to speak on this? Does the department want to speak, or? Very good, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Committee. My name is Tom Montoya. I'm with the Wyoming Department of Revenue Liquor Division. And I did send out a sheet that looks just like this. And this is just a spreadsheet that we provide to the LSO every year, just to give you an idea of what the malt beverage tax is. In the very first box on that sheet, the actual tax collected for fiscal year 2024 was $247,768. So that's the amount we're talking about. Now, what we do to get these figures, that's an actual figure, but we actually run a 7-year trend line. And that's how you'll see the numbers projected out. We'll adjust those every year based on actual collections. But, beer is slightly trending up, which is, it's been trending down year over year for a number of years. But in the last couple of years, it's just had a slight uptick in Wyoming, which is surprising because worldwide it's trending down. All of alcohol is trending down right now. There's a number of reasons for that, but in my 34 years, I've never seen it like it is today. So, and with that, Mr. Chairman, I have, if anybody has any questions on all beverage taxes, that's it.
Any questions? And your last name, I'm sorry?
Montoya?
Montoya, I'm sorry, I didn't get that, thank you. Any questions for Mr. Montoya? Representative Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for coming today. Can you tell me, where does this go once you collect it?
Mr. Montoya.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Lean, all taxes, excise taxes, spirits, wines, and malt beverages go to the general fund.
Thank you. Any other questions for Mr. Montoya, Representative Storr?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here, Mr. Montoya. I'm curious what the average tax on beer is for our fellow states across the country. Do you happen to know what that average
Mr.
might
Montoya.
be on a per gallon basis?
Sorry.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Storr, we've looked at this in the past for similar type bills. The median in the United States is about 20 cents. per gallon. Wyoming, it's 2 cents a gallon. So that rate was set in 1935. There's been attempts to adjust it over the years, but it's just never happened.
Well, Representative Storr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So it looks like, so our spirits and wine is, well, I guess the direct ship wine and sold in your stores at 28 cents a gallon, according to your, and then 94 cents a gallon for spirits. Am I reading that correctly?
Mr. Montoya.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Storr, you're correct. And we do that just for ease of understanding. You know, it was put into the metric system mid-'80s, 84, 86 or something like that. And, you know, we don't understand, by we, I mean me, don't really understand metric system that well. And so that's why we've reduced it to the gallonage. You know, the simplest way to look at that on a wine, if you look at a case of wine, and that's 12 750 milliliter bottles, that's about 98 cents that you're paying for a case of wine. So, and it's about $2.25 for a case of spirits.
Thank you. Any other questions? Representative Storr, please.
So that seems like a pretty low level of tax. But as a wine drinker myself, who rarely drinks beer, is it fair to say that I'm subsidizing my fellow beer drinkers as a result?
Mr. Montoya.
Mr. Chairman, I guess that's one way to look at it.
Maybe it's good we get a little laugh in this room to make sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Anyone else? Questions for Mr. Montoya? Thank you so much, sir. Appreciate that. Anyone else like to speak on this one, this bill?
Mr. Chairman,
please.
members of the committee, Mike Mosier, Wyoming State Liquor Association. So for those of you who don't know what we do, we have about 400 members across the state of Wyoming, branching from on to off-premise clubs, et cetera. I have a handout that you should have all received that kind of overviews the numbers I'm going to give. This is an old friend, as the Good Bill sponsor mentioned. We've never really pushed it that hard, but the last time it hit the House floor was in 2015, House Bill 140, where it passed the House floor on third reading, 49-11. So this has been a popular concept, it just hasn't been approached much. One thing I want to bring out is this is more of a policy decision than it is a beer decision. It's a matter of, is $247,000 worth the tax? Is it going to lower your beer prices? Unfortunately, probably not, although that wouldn't affect Representative Storr. The big thing is the burden to the business. As the Good Bill sponsor mentioned with microbreweries, et cetera, looking at taxes and determining, and as tax policy, is this tax worth it, is always, I think, something worth looking at. We just had a bill yesterday that removes the tobacco tax on everything except cigarettes. That's a $6 million note. This is $250,000. My joke has been for years that doubling the beer tax is the only way you can make 250,000 people mad over $250,000. It's a pretty small figure. Now, one thing I'd like to point out is there is a federal tax that is in existence on all alcohol products that's significantly higher. As you see in my fact sheet, the federal tax is $3.50 a barrel, 31 gallons is a barrel. For smaller producers, but it's $16 for larger producers. That amount was actually lowered by yes, it's true, the federal government actually lowered a tax to reduce the burden on small beer producers. One of the things, and humor me, Mr. Chairman, I'll give you a quick synopsis on how we collect money on alcohol. The excise tax is a small percentage of the amount of money we bring in. Wyoming is a control state. There are 17 control states and 1 control county, Montgomery County, Maryland, just in case you're curious. Some of those states, and if you've been to Utah and Idaho, those states are control states, but they control the wholesale and they control the packaged liquor, the off-premise. So you go into a state store to buy your alcohol. Wyoming is an elegant solution because we have one central warehouse with 40 or 50 employees that does distribution across the state of Wyoming, but that's all they do is wholesale distribution and sales of wine and spirits. Beer is privatized, which is why the tax collection is on the private businesses rather than the state of Wyoming. It's part of the reason we're not pushing, committee, for a removal of wine and spirits tax. That's calculated in by the state. And so it's an automatic factor that's worked in. If you look at a state like Colorado, which is privatized, and the only real method of tax collection they have, or revenue they have on alcohol, is excise tax, we collect a significant more, I think over almost 5 times more money per capita off alcohol in Wyoming than a state like Colorado, because we have a 17.6% markup on all wine and spirits going out of the state. Now, in 1995, back when Mr. Montoya was a compliance agent and I was a hospitality business owner, some of you might remember the Cloud9 in Cheyenne. That was mine. That was 1995 was my first experience in your world, because the talk was privatizing, and the Director of Department of Revenue was instructed to look at privatizing the Liquor Commission at that time. Very thorough approach. It was decided that for Wyoming, correctly, that for Wyoming, the current system works. However, the commission was moved into the Liquor Division under the Department of Revenue and became the Liquor Division. I do not know of a single retailer in the state of Wyoming that would support privatization of the Liquor Division. It works great for everybody. We get next day delivery, a fair price, transparency, special orders, the whole thing. However, beer is a different world, and that's why collection is different. And so, like said, once again, the burden of collection falls on businesses rather than through the state of Wyoming itself. As you go through, essentially, like I said, this is a policy decision. Will it make your beer cheaper? Probably not. Now, if you increase it, yeah, you probably would pay more for beer. But in Wyoming, you have to look, or I have to look at the total picture. How much does alcohol bring into the state of Wyoming? It brings about $20 million in. About $1 million or so is excise tax, and the rest is off that markup. And if you look at that total picture, we do just fine. The question is that $20 million enough? I feel it probably is, and it's been increasing, by the way. One of the interesting things about the demographics of alcohol is 20 years ago, we were only profiting about 5 million. Now we're doing about 20 million. Part of it is because people aren't, a large part of it is people aren't drinking more, they're drinking better. Especially wine drinkers and whiskey drinkers. More people are drinking really more high-end stuff, the stuff that Mr. Montoya drinks, rather than the cheap swill that I drink. And so it works really well, and that way you're not selling more alcohol, you're just selling better alcohol. And the way that 17.6% markup works, unlike an excise tax, which is on volume, is expensive stuff brings in more money. And so the way the system works is quite elegant. Removing this tax, I don't think is gonna make a whole lot of difference one way or the other to the total revenue picture. It's $247,000. The question is do we want that burden on these businesses and just get rid of the tax altogether and rely on the other revenue sources that are bringing in tens of millions of dollars? With that, committee, thank you for the opportunity, and I'll be glad to take questions.
Any questions from Mr. Mosher?
Mr. Chairman.
Representative
Mr.
Stivar.
Mosher, I've been waiting for you to come in front of this, my committee this whole time. Now, the question I got is, I got two questions. You're part of the 82nd Airborne, so that answers the question why you owned a thing. But what falls from the sky?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman, what falls from the sky is bird poop and darn fools. Was that the proper answer? Thank you, sir.
Mr. Mosher, okay. All right, any other questions? Representative Storer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That last one was over my head. let's see. I appreciate the idea that for our local breweries, this could be a burden, but I'm curious how much total beer does that represent being consumed in the state as compared to the national beer producers? Thanks.
Mr. Moser.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Storr, earlier you'd asked a question of Mr. Montoya about comparative taxes around. Some are as low as 6 cents a gallon, Colorado's 8 cents a gallon. And so the question of collection is always going to come up. The smaller microbreweries, I think it was in 2014, we passed Senate File 144, which lowered the amount of barrels to be a microbrewery from 100 to 50. And so if you look at the sheet, that literally, as the good bill sponsor brought up, that literally means some of these microbreweries are doing a monthly check for $2.50. Now, they still have to pay federal excise tax, which is paid, I believe, on a quarterly basis. And they still have to report to production, even with the passage of this bill, to the liquor division, because they have to brew those 50 gallons to qualify for a microbrewery license. But that's where the burden now, my good friends in the malt beverage wholesaler community have to fill those out too. But it's a different world because they have accounting departments for the most part and that sort of thing. But the microbreweries, as mentioned before, I think are the ones that are doing the more paperwork. The question is whether the paperwork's worth it. Does that answer your question?
Representative Storr.
Follow up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Somewhat, and maybe this is a question for Mr. Fanning, just thinking about if we exempted producers that produce in the state versus those that don't, whether that might be possible and make sense since it's not that much of a burden. And it is at least collecting some of the money that helps pay for the process we have.
Mr. Moser.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Storr, great question. I hadn't thought about that. This is a bill, obviously, I'm not falling on my sword over. Privatization of the liquor division, yes, I would fall on my sword for that. But that being said, carving out Wyoming microbreweries certainly is a possibility. I don't think the burden is as onerous for larger businesses that do larger distribution. And so that's certainly something to be considered. However, once again, you're probably talking $40,000 or $50,000 at that point. The financial impact would be much lower.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr.
Any
Chairman.
other questions? Mr. Moser. Okay. Thank you. Please proceed.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, my name is Tyler Lindholm. I'm the State Director for Americans for Prosperity here in the state of Wyoming. We're on and in favor of this legislation. And Mr. Chairman, it's for a lot of the reasons that Mr. Moser said. I'm not going to restate a lot of those, but I did want to add a little bit of, I guess, as far as clarity, the last time that this legislation was run. It was also ran with a companion bill. At the time, the chairman of the House Revenue Committee ran the bill to eliminate the beer tax. At the same time, he ran a piece of legislation to raise the beer tax because his stance was we should either raise this because it's a silly amount of money that we're actually collecting versus what the actual intent is, or we should remove it. Much to the House Revenue Chairman's chagrin, the House chose to just repeal. That was not his intent, but that's what we just ended up doing. And so I think that sends kind of a message. And Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, you heard testimony from the Liquor Division that beer sales had been trending down for years. And what I'd like to point out, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, when we look at some of these regressive types of taxes that are put on different products because maybe the government doesn't view them in a good way, it's put in place to discourage the use. You see that with cigarette tax and what have you. Clearly, this is not discouraging anyone, right? That additional tax it's not actually working the way it's supposed to. And then on top of that, Mr. Chairman, then you've got the added burden to small businesses. It's not a lot of money. They could probably pay it out of their kids' piggy bank. But they have to send in that check. They have to stay compliant, and it's the only tax within the Liquor Division that works this way, where the burden lies with the company, not on the state to collect that tax. And so that's why you don't see wine or liquor in this legislation, as Mr. Mosier mentioned, is it's collected very differently in that situation. With beer, it's on the business. It's on those small businesses to collect. And so that's why we're on in favor of this legislation, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Lindholm or Representative Lean?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for coming today. My question is, if we remove this tax, do you anticipate other small businesses to come to us and ask that we remove their taxes as well?
Mr. Chairman.
Representative, sorry.
Recovering.
Mr. Lindholm. I've done that a few times today. I'm on a roll.
You're busy, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, to the good representative's question, I think that's probably a possibility. I don't know that there's a lot of regressive type taxes out there where it's such a small amount, where essentially we're just taxing for the sake of tax, even though the state's not actually making any kind of money. I suspect if we looked at how much it costs the state of Wyoming to collect this tax, because it is such a small amount, that we're probably flush, if not it's where it's actually costing the state. So, Mr. Chairman, to the good representative's point, I think that would be a great opportunity to start looking at different types of taxes. Is this a net good? Is this a social good for the state of Wyoming? Are we actually doing what the intent of the state was when they passed this legislation? And so in the beer tax, right after Prohibition, clearly not. The intent has been lost. We're probably costing the state by doing this. And so if there's more entities that step forward and they're like, hey, actually, this is a real burden too, and we're not achieving anything with this, I think that's a great opportunity for Wyoming to remain one of the top states as a business-friendly environment by reducing that taxation.
Other questions for Mr. Lindholm? Representative Storr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Perhaps a question for Mr. Montoya, but I understand that RTD, ready-to-drink alcohol drinks have been on the rise, and like hard seltzers, or we have a hard cider producer actually in Teton County. Am I correct that these would not fall under that, the definition of malt beverages?
Mr. Lindholm.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, to my knowledge, some definitely would, but I'll leave that to Director Montoya. I would also point out that a significant difference between the western side of the state. I think the western side of the state might be more into seltzers and fruity type of drinks. The eastern side of the state, we're more into darker lagers, Mr. Chairman.
The follow-up, Representative Storr, have we completely lost it now? Okay. Other questions for Mr. Lindholm? Mr. Brown, Representative Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm looking at this, and when I look at sales tax, where I'll be obvious, I'm honest, I don't like any kind of tax. But at the same time, we're looking at something that's a choice, and we are in the legislature this year looking at property tax, which to me is a big deal. And something like this, we need to replace that revenue someplace if we're going to cut property tax. I don't see, in my opinion, this being as big a deal. Do you feel like this is as big a deal as property taxes?
Mr. Lindholm.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, no. Our stance at Americans for Prosperity when we're looking at taxation is equitable. It has to be equitable, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. And so when we look at sales tax and those types of things, typically you'll find us opposing exemptions in those types of situations. Our stance is let's lower everyone at the same time. Get rid of the exemptions and lower everyone. So when it comes down to the beer tax, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, you do pay a sales tax on that beer. Plus, you got the plus up. So in this situation, that's why we're in favor of this legislation, is because it does equalize. And our hope is that we could work with the Revenue Committee in the future on more of that equalization and taxation. So it is equitable. So everybody does pay the same amount, and we can all lower together, hopefully, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, anyone else to speak on this bill? From the public? Anybody online? Donna? No one online? Anyone to speak? Please, Mr. Montoya, please come up. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Tom Montoya, Wyoming Liquor Division. I just wanted to clear up a couple of questions that Representative Storer had. As far exempting the Wyoming microbreweries, which there are 49 of them in Wyoming right now, there are a couple of Supreme Court cases. One's the Granholm case and one is the Tennessee case. And what those cases said was that we cannot treat out-of-state and in-state differently. As a matter of fact, when we first passed the direct shipment of wine back in 2000, so people could belong to a Wine of the Month club or get onto like an internet company and order their favorite wine that they couldn't find in Wyoming. We didn't allow Wyoming wineries, not because we didn't want to, it's just the bill hadn't progressed that far. So we had to adjust the law to allow Wyoming wineries to be able to direct ship as well because of those Supreme Court cases. So that would probably run into a legal issue if we exempted just Wyoming microbreweries. Also, she asked about RTDs. Great question, too. The number one product that we sell in the Wyoming Liquor Division today is an RTD. But there are a lot of malt beverage products that malt beverage wholesalers sell that are considered RTDs as well. And they're usually a hard seltzer or something like that, but they're malt beverage based and they're produced under that way. But it was also include like hard lemonades, some types of ciders, those types of things. It's not just beer. There's a lot of products that would fall under this category.
Thank you. Any other questions? Representative Ward.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And hopefully this is an appropriate question to ask you. If not, maybe somebody else can answer. But, we've talked about how burdensome this process is for our microbrewers. They go through all the paperwork and we're only getting a $2.50 check is what I heard testified. The question I had is they still got to do the paperwork to file the federal tax, correct?
Mr. Montoya.
Mr. Chairman, that is correct.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I guess the question I have, they're already going through sounds like maybe a burdensome process on the federal end. To have the state piggybacking on it, I don't see that it adds that much more. I would assume it's just a matter of another line in that process. But the question I have is, does it make sense? Would it be possible to just have a flat tax rate that the state charges if you're a microbrewer? Could you just say, I mean, if it's $250 a month, could you just say at the end of the year, write us a check for $15, whatever it is? But it seems like to me we should maybe look at the possibility of taking some of that burden off of the producers. So I guess that's the question I have is, could we come up with just a flat tax rate and lighten that load?
Mr. Montoya.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Ward, I think that would be a bit hard to justify, only because we have some microbreweries that are probably doing 60 barrels a year. The threshold minimum is 50 barrels. And some are doing 25,000 barrels. So the inequities in tax on something like that would be pretty big.
Thank you, Mr. Montoya.
Well, Mr. Chairman, couldn't you come up with a scale? I would think you could say, guys producing 25 barrels pay this, guys that produce 50 barrels pay this. I would think there's got to be a way. It sounds like, but it really sounds like to me they're already having to go through this to pay the federal tax. To piggyback a state tax on it's probably not that much more burdensome. But
Mr. Montoya.
Mr. Chairman, we at the Liquor Division would serve at the pleasure of the legislature once laws are written. If that's what you want us to do, we would be happy to do that, sir.
Okay. Other questions for Mr. Montoya?
thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Oh, Representative Storer, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So many questions here. when you said that the RTD, you have one product that is, provides, that's the biggest volume or the biggest tax generator? I'm just curious.
Mr. Montoya.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Starter, our number one product that we sell at the Wyoming Liquor Division is an RTD. It comes from one company. They're the world's largest winery that they produce, and we actually buy this literally by the truckloads. We'll get 3 or 4 truckloads in at a time. And if you are ever on our docks, and please come out anytime, I'd love to show you the Wyoming Liquor Division. You'll see that just about every single order that goes out our door is going to have several cases of this one product. It's amazing because the number one product for years in Wyoming has been a Canadian whiskey of some sort. This has always been a Canadian whiskey state. So to see an RTD take over was really quite surprising to me. And I've been doing this for 34 years. So yeah, it was kind of crazy, but it's extremely popular.
Interesting. All right. Any other questions or anyone else speaking on or against this bill, or Representative Thorpe?
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I'm just wondering whether, would there be another way? Sorry, Mr. Montoya, this might be a question for you. Whether there would be a different way to administer this tax that would be less burdensome to the microbreweries that are having to submit monthly reports. Would there be a de minimis or just a quarterly report that would work with the federal report they do, or some other way to do this?
Mr. Montoya, please.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Storer, you know, this bill does not eliminate their requirement to do a report. As Mr. Mosier alluded to, they're still going to have to report because there's a law in the books that says that they have to meet that threshold of 50 barrels. And so they pay off the production report. It's really a pretty simple report. It just says, this is how many barrels I've produced this month. Really, what they're just not going to have to do is write a check if this bill were to pass. But the reporting has still got to be there because they've got to prove to the local licensing authority. Microbreweries are issued by local licensing authorities. In other words, the local cities or local counties issue those liquor licenses. And so they've still got to be able to prove that they've met that minimum to renew their microbrewery permit.
Any questions for Mr. Montoya? Try not to miss people this time. Okay. Thank you, sir. Appreciate that. Anybody else? Then we'll close public comment on House Bill 124. Committee, what's your pleasure? Moved by Representative Lucas, second by Representative Campbell. Okay, committee, any amendments to the bill? We'll start with page 2, page 3, page 4. Okay, no amendments. Any discussion on further discussion on the bill? Representative Orr.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I guess I'm gonna speak against the bill. I'm gonna vote against it for the same reason I voted against the last one. I think I would really rather look at the way we do all tax collections and restructure our taxing. I'm concerned that we're doing all these piecemeal. And I think there's other avenues we can go to. I mean, to me, this is one I almost feel guilty voting against it because I think it's a non-issue, but I think it's also, it sends a message. I think we got to be cognizant of all the cuts we're making. And I would rather collectively look at the whole picture rather than doing all these little piecemeal cuts. So that's why I'm going to vote against it. That's why I voted against the prior bill. But that's all I have to say, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Worf. Representative Lane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I as well am a no tax, low tax person, and I'm concerned that we're opening the door for winners and losers on small businesses. And so I as well will be a no tax, but want to take this up in the interim and make sure that we're overseeing all of the taxes.
Representative Brown?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Lynn stole much of my thunder. I'm a no tax person. And again, picking winners and losers. I just feel like, you know, this is a product that is not something somebody has to have. It's a choice. I feel like, as Representative Worf does, we need to look at this as a whole. We need to look at this as everything together and bring stuff down together. So that's where I'm at.
Any other discussion? Seeing none. Don, if you'd call roll.
This is a roll call vote on House Bill 124, Reduction in Taxation Act. Representative Brown?
No.
Representative Campbell?
Aye.
Representative Lean?
No.
Representative Lucas?
Aye.
Representative Riggins excused. Representative Storer?
No.
Representative Stivar?
No.
Representative Worf?
No.
Chairman Locke? Mr. Chairman, we have 2 aye, 6 no, and 1 excused.
I'm going to turn over the chairmanship to Vice Chair Stivar.
Vice Chair, I think you'll do great.
Thank you. Next bill up for consideration is House Bill 104, Child Tax Credit. Representative Yan, please proceed.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Members of House Revenue, I bring before you House Bill 104, Child Tax Credit. So, you know, I was thinking about what are some ways where we can support our communities, our families in Wyoming to make sure that they can best succeed? And how can we make it broad, right? So we have things like, we have some property tax reform, and we have things like the voucher programs that could help some individual families that want to do homeschooling. But this is broader. This is about supporting all of the families in the state to make sure that they can have the opportunity to succeed. And so this is structured as a tax credit. It essentially is a credit on sales tax paid by a family, and it is up to $200 per child for 2 children. This has been something that has been done on the federal income tax, and the studies based on that credit in our federal income tax have been very positive across the entire country on reducing child poverty and making sure that kids get fed, but also making sure that parents have the opportunity to access things like childcare when it is getting harder and harder to achieve, to make sure that those families have the opportunity to go to work, to do that hard work, make a living. And so this provides more opportunity for all of that. And like I said, it's only targeted towards folks with kids, and it is, because we don't have an income tax in the state, it's structured as a sales tax credit. So it goes under the assumption that folks pay up to $400 in sales tax in the state, and it presumes that to be the case. And with that, happy to take any questions.
Representative Wharf?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess, Representative Yin, the question I had, I apologize, but you said that the maximum of 2 children, is that correct? That would be credited?
Mr. Chairman, let me see where we have this. So we have the I, where it's $200 per child, and then we have the A, big IV, where the not to exceed $400.
So, Mr. Chairman, I guess the question I have is, it would seem like a family of 4 or 4 kids would probably be in dire need of the tax credit for all 4 of the kids rather than just 2. Is there a reason you restricted it to a maximum of $400?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Wars, I wanted to start small. I didn't want to take too big of a bite that we couldn't chew it. And so that's why it's just limited the way it is. But open to committee considerations on changing that however the committee would like.
Follow-up?
No, that's just a question I had as far as like fairness. I mean, if we're trying to do a tax credit, I don't know that the federal tax credit, I only had 2 kids, so I couldn't claim anymore. But I believe the federal tax credit, you get credit for every one of your kids, not just the first 2.
Representative Lane?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a unique concept, and I just want to know, is the intent of this to lay a groundwork for a state income tax?
Mr. Chairman, absolutely not. 100% absolutely not. This is to support Wyoming families. We have the assumption that they pay sales taxes in the state, and this is a constitutional way to make sure that they can support their kids.
Representative Lucas?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Floor Minority Leader Yin. I don't see any income limitations on this, so everybody with 2 children under the age of 18 would be eligible to claim this credit?
Mr. Chairman, yes, that's correct. There is no means testing. This is to ensure that every family has equal opportunity to support their kids. Oh, Mr. Chairman, and I remember now. So sorry, it's an early morning and I was sitting in House Ag for the select water bill. So the presumption is that they've paid up to $400 in sales tax. I believe that if they have more than 2 kids, they could come with paperwork saying that they've paid more than $400 in sales tax. So they could get a bigger refund if they had more children, but they would have to prove that they had paid more than $400. So we have an automatic presumption that they've paid up to $400 in sales tax. So they could get up to $200 per child. But if they have more children, they could still apply for more refund, but they would have to prove that they've paid more than $400 in sales tax. My apologies on the mispresentation of that.
Representative Lucas?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Minority Floor Leader Yin, what would be the device then for claiming this credit? I'm a little fuzzy. It's during tax season, but Wyoming doesn't have an income tax, so, TurboTax won't work on that. So I'm a little curious on just how that would go about happening. Thank you.
So, Mr. Chairman, thank you, Representative Lucas. So we see in the big A, each person shall apply to the department for a credit under this paragraph in a manner and form required by the department, not later than March 1st of the applicable tax year. So we have the property tax refund program, for example, still a program where you submit a form, and then the department can credit you on that.
Follow-up?
No, sir, thank you.
Representative Lane?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Have we given any thought to the impact that this could have on counties that collect spec tax? Like the 1 cent tax for senior districts and such?
Representative Yan?
Mr. Chairman, I put a lot of effort into making sure that this doesn't affect any of our communities, except in a positive way. So it doesn't reduce tax for any community. All of these credits come from the state. So every community still gets all of their sales tax revenue, still gets their SPET revenue, still gets any other revenue. The only, the money just comes from the state. Because we think by bringing the bill and if we pass the bill, we believe that it's important for the state to support Wyoming families.
Representative Storr?
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. Thank you, Representative Yen. So just doing some quick math, the argument is that a family with 2 children might spend up to $7,300 or so on items that are taxable. But this would give them another $400 in their pocket that they would probably end up spending as well in their communities. So in some ways, it might even raise revenues for local counties modestly.
Representative Yan?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Storr, that would be correct. It's putting money in our families' pockets that they definitely will spend in their communities.
I have a question, Representative. So the refunds will come out of the general fund? And looking at the fiscal note, that's $5 million a year?
Mr. Chairman, yes, all of that is correct. So the program can only be in place as long as we appropriate money for it. And so the beginning appropriation would be a $5 million appropriation.
Thank you.
And Mr. Chairman, if we decided for just like the property tax refund program, if we decided any year that we didn't have the funds for the program, the only thing that we would have to do is not appropriate money to it, and then the Department of Revenue wouldn't issue refunds.
No more questions. Department? Stand by.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Brenda Henson, Director of the Department of Revenue. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the administration of House Bill 104. As was mentioned by the sponsor, this is a refund check that the Department of Revenue would be responsible for administering the refund program, very similar to the property tax refund program. Now, keep in mind, the property tax refund program, we process approximately 15,000 applications. Now, on this particular program, the Census Bureau estimates that there are 129,652 children under the age of 18 years old in Wyoming. The appropriation that's within this bill is the $5 million number. Now, that would fully fund, and when I say fully fund, that's $200. That would fully fund about 25,000 refunds. There's a statement within the bill on page 3, starting on line 19. In the event funds appropriated to the department are insufficient to provide full refunds under this paragraph, refunds shall be prorated. So we would anticipate receiving applications that would be significantly higher than 25,000 of the 129,000, the number of children in Wyoming. So that would reduce the amount. So we would need to receive all the applications by that March 1 deadline, determine how many refunds need to be processed, and then take $5 million divided by that amount to determine what the refund checks are going to be. This is a significant lift I would be remiss if I did not make that statement, in that anytime you have an application process, we envision that we would want to have an online application process. The possibility of processing even 75 to 100,000 manual applications just is not cost effective. We look at the property tax refund program and how much time and staff time it takes for that program. We do have a fiscal note. We anticipate approximately 45 temp positions in order to process, answer phone calls, get the information. Now, I do appreciate the sponsor including that if the parent, the applicant, does not have receipts in order to prove the amount of sales tax, that there's a maximum of $400. But keep in mind that if they do have receipts, then that's a matter of us looking at their documentation to determine, how much did they pay in sales tax? Because then that would justify a larger refund. So we have asked for an appropriation for temp staff of $1,224,000. We would have one-time costs to prop up a website. That would be approximately $182,832, and that was a number that we received from Enterprise Technology Services to actually write that program to prop that up. Now, that would be a one-time cost, and then we would just have maintenance on that program unless there were statutory changes. Unfortunately, right now I have a total of 153 employees, 124 employees, 50 plus are out at the liquor division. So to find a place to put staff to process these applications is an additional cost. Bottom line, it would be about $1.6 million to administer this program with the one-time programming costs. And then each year that the program is funded, then we would need that approximately $1.2 million for temporary staff. As stated, if we had an income tax in the state of Wyoming, and there are multiple states that have tax credits available as a function of an income tax structure. We just don't have that in Wyoming. And very few of our residents actually keep track of how much sales tax they spend. For income tax, federal income tax purposes, even for that, they have implemented a standard deduction for sales tax so that Wyoming residents in other states that don't have an income tax could get a set amount. So I do appreciate the maximum of $400 on that sales tax piece. I think the key to this program is the fact that we do need to prop up, administering this and making sure that we're treating everyone that's applying in a fair manner. Now, we did provide our estimated fiscal note. Working with Economic Analysis, they anticipate 50% of the applicants would apply. The bill contemplates 25,000 out of the 129,000 that are under the age of 18. I believe that would be higher, but we don't know until you implement the program the first year. We just aren't going to know how many people will apply for this benefit. And the other portion of that is just ensuring that we recognize that if they miss any deadline, there's no ability for a applicant to appeal the decision of the Department of Revenue. Just wanted to make sure that that's recognized as well. If we receive an application in May and we're past the deadline, we take those deadline seriously, and we would not provide any refund, and there wouldn't be an ability for the taxpayer to appeal that at this point. With that, Mr. Chairman, I would be happy to stand for any questions the committee may have.
Questions for the department? I have one. Paying sales tax, and the way I read this, is they pay more than $400, they can get a bigger sum back. So if somebody goes buys a used car for $3,000, they're gonna have over $400 in taxes right there, correct? So they could add that on. It's any sales tax?
Mr. Chairman, I think it would be important to follow up on that. If we go to page 2 at the top of the page, line 1, it says each full-time resident of Wyoming shall be entitled to a credit against any taxes paid to Wyoming for each person. So it's not just sales tax. So your specific situation, absolutely, you would have that. But this is any taxes paid. So property taxes also would be included in this if they own property. It's just that in no case shall the credit authorized under this paragraph exceed the total taxes paid by the person.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Lucas?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Henson, a pleasure to see you today. But just to clarify, it is $200 per child, regardless of how much you've spent in property or other taxes or sales taxes, correct?
Mr. Chairman, if I may, yeah. Representative
ahead, Rick.
Lucas, that's correct. So if you had 2 children and you pay $800 in property tax and we have the $400 presumption in sales tax, the max you could get is $400. But if you had 8 children, for whatever reason, I don't recommend having 8 children, you could get up to $1,600, assuming you could prove that you paid that $1,600 in taxes. And again, this is to make sure that we're being constitutional, we're not giving out money, we're crediting money that people have already paid to us.
Representative Storr?
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Perhaps a question for the director and the bringer of the bill, thinking about just the option of trying to simplify the administration and targeting the relief. Were it to be means tested, probably just by, level of income, would that be easier to, and less expensive to administer? If it's just an affidavit. I'm just wondering whether you guys have thought about that.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Storr, we have an application process that will have to be in place. What the qualifiers are, you could add a means test if you wish. It may reduce the number of applicants that qualify. But I don't, basically, it's very similar to the property tax refund program. They provide us with their income numbers, and then we have our system, our software, that compares that to the median residential household income. And if it's below the number by statute, then they would qualify. This is the type of software that we would believe would be in place. So I don't think it would increase the administrative burden. The only thing I will say is that anytime you need that supporting documentation related to the income, it's just another piece of information that the applicant, so it's a little bit more of a ask for the applicant, but from the Department of Revenue's perspective, it's no additional.
So Mr. Chairman, Representative Storr, I'm not opposed to making a means-tested program. I do think that I wanted to structure something that is relatively simple for the applicant and for something that can reach people who, we have lots of family members who are renters, and I didn't want to structure something as another property tax program.
Any more questions? Let's open it up to the public now. Anybody in the public wants to speak on this? Please come up, state your name and who you're representing. Is there anyone online? Okay, thank you. Go ahead, ma'am. State your name and who you're representing.
Good morning. My name is Micah Richardson. I'm with the Wyoming Women's Foundation, and we are very interested in this bill. As you might imagine, this could be really great for families and for women, but we really appreciate the items that were brought up. And so I just wanted to point out, we would love to think on this more to make this into a reality for Wyoming women and families. One point I wanted to bring up through you, Chair, and Representative Storr, you asked about a means test. And it just kind of so happens that about 15% of children in Wyoming are food insecure, which totals about 16,000 children. And if you were to implement a means test, that basically falls kind of right in that $5 million range. And so just as a note, in terms of the numbers and what that could look like moving forward. I don't really have any suggestions. And right now, like I said, we are really interested in something going forward, but are fully aware and appreciative of the discussion and kind of the barriers or the hiccups that we'll have to get through to make something like this a reality. So, and I just appreciate Representative Yin bringing this forward.
Any questions? Okay, thank you, ma'am. Anyone else? Nobody's online? What's your pleasure? Oh. Yes, Representative Yin, will you please come back up? Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for coming back up, Mr. Yin. My question has come about with divorced children. How would we allocate those funds? Would one family member be able to claim over the other? Would they both be able to receive this tax? Have you given that any thought?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Lean, that's an excellent question. I think that that's something that could be promulgated in rules by the department to figure out how to solve that. And so we have that allowance for them in the bill. However, I mean, if you think that there's a reasonable way to do that in statute, I'm also not opposed to figuring that out as well.
Any more questions? What's your pleasure, committee?
Move the bill.
Moved by Storr.
I'll second it just for discussion purposes.
Seconded by Representative Wharf. Go ahead, Representative Wharf.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's something that's worth exploring, but I think it's probably a good conceptual idea right now. But I think based on the testimony from the director, I think it's got a lot more cost associated with it. The implementation of the program would be pretty high bar right now. And I do think, like I said, my aim is for us to really look at how we structure the taxes. I think this is something that we could look at how we pull all this in. I think it's really what we need. I mean, the families, I know I think everybody on this committee is trying to help the families in our state. We know that they're struggling, but I just think this is premature. So I'm going to vote against it, but I just wanted the committee to be able to talk about it.
Representative Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I feel pretty much the same way. The one problem that I really have with this is that it limits it to 2 children. I think if a family decides to have 8 children, that's their business, and they should be treated the same. The federal government allows for multiple children like that. I just feel like, you know, this, again, this is not in the way we want to structure it. I believe families need relief. I'm just not sure this is the way we need to do it.
Representative Storr?
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. I think it's really important to understand that, like almost every state, Wyoming is a regressive state when it comes to our tax system. And what that means is we're asking more from the people at the lower end of the economic scale to pay more in taxes, most specifically, generally in sales tax, even with our exemption on food. We ask, according to the Institute for Tax and Economic Policy, something I've just taken a look at over the years, we ask families that make less than $28,000, many of which are single women with children, to pay 11% of their income in taxes. That is a significant burden. And where a family who is probably more middle-class family making $90,000 or so is paying more like 7%. So I do think this is a great idea, and I think it really moves in the right direction. And you know, perhaps with some tweaking, we can address the issue of the number of children. I don't disagree with my colleague, Representative Brown, that perhaps recognizing that families with a larger number of children are just as burdened. I think that's something we could do through an amendment, and perhaps figure out how we can lower the cost. But this would be significant for a lot of families in this state, and I think it moves in the right direction. So I'd ask for your consideration.
Representative Lane?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple of concerns are that once we have this groundwork laid for this, I'm worried that we'll open up to a state income tax, and I want to be very cautious that we don't do that. The other thing I want to say is that I'm hopeful that with all the tax revisions that we'll be able to do in the interim, that we're going to be able to look at, that when we propose legislation in the budget session next year, that hopefully we can leave more than $400 in the pockets of our constituents right now. And so I really appreciate the bringer of the bill being creative in the way that you're bringing this forward and looking after families. I applaud you for that. And I still have some consideration to do on this. Thank you.
No more questions? Let's work the bill. Is there any amendments on page 1? Any proposed amendments on page 2? Any proposed amendments on page 3? Any proposed amendments on page 4? Any amendments on section 4, page 5? Question being called. Ma'am, will you please take roll?
This is a roll call vote on House Bill 104, Child Tax Credit. Representative Brown?
No.
Representative Campbell?
No.
Representative Lean?
Aye.
Representative Lucas?
Aye.
Representative Riggins, excused. Representative Storer?
Aye.
Representative Stivar?
No.
Representative Wharf?
No.
And Chairman Locke.
Excused.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, we have 3 aye, 4 no, and 2 excused. Sure, that's fine, we can continue it.
Change of plan. Representative Lean's also a co-sponsor on this bill, so, and Representative Lucas. I'll let Representative Lean
No, thank you. I appreciate it.
to go ahead and present this bill. Exemption for transporting fuel on power sales amendments. Go ahead, Representative Lean.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, committee. The short notice did not allow me to put together a polished presentation, so thank you for allowing me to fill in for good Representative Locke as he is next door to presenting another piece of legislation. This act is just amending a taxation on pipelines, and it's really the feeder pipes that go from the pipelines to the, I'm going to speak wrong. I'm not sure if it's a wellhead or a holding situation. So I do understand that it is the feeder pipelines that we're trying to remove the tax on. And on page 2, there's added language on lines 12 and 13 that regardless of the ownership of the transported tangible personal property, and then at the bottom of page 2, starting on the end of line 17, as used in subparagraph, pipeline means a system of connected pipes or other equipment that is used to transport oil, natural gas, or other hydrocarbon from a well site to an interstate or interstate transmission customer sales point, including between intermediate points along the transportation path. And then that page 3, just that the Department of Revenue shall promulgate the rules to implement this act, and that it becomes effective. Part of it would be effective immediately and part of it effective July 1st, giving them a chance to put those rules in place. And with that, I'd be open to any questions.
Questions? Representative Storr?
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Thank you, Representative Lean, for the presentation. Just tell me what your thinking is behind this bill and why you're a co-sponsor.
The thinking behind it is that our local producers that have small oil and gas rigs, that they'll be able to save a little bit of money to be able to transport it from point A to B to be able to get it into commercial use.
Follow-up, Representative Storr?
Thank you, Vice Chair. Help me understand who that is in the state versus the big producers, I guess.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Storr, I do know that there are over 400 small wellhead producers in the state of Wyoming for both oil and natural gas. And this just gives them the opportunity to use those pipelines, and that transportation method would not be taxed at that point. And so those producers do employ more than 25,000 individuals, which is 25,000 homes within the state of Wyoming. And I will defer to the department so that maybe they could give you numbers on what that looks like.
No more questions? The department would like to come up and speak. Is there anybody in the public that wants to speak on this? Anybody online? Right.
Mr. Chairman, Brenda Henson, Director of the Department of Revenue. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to this bill. There is some history here. So this is an exemption of electricity. So that is the focus of this bill. And there's history in that there has been statutory changes the last year. There's also, unfortunately, we are amidst litigation. So it's important that historically, the way our statutes read, that there was an exemption for electricity used when an entity was engaged in the transportation business. And that has been interpreted by the Department of Revenue historically as railroad and pipeline companies. We did have litigation that was challenging what did engaged in the transportation business. What was that intention of the legislature for that exemption? And due to that, we came to the legislature and asked, historically, the interpretation has been pipeline companies and railroads, where basically you're hiring a company to transport your product. The legislature, after that, went ahead and changed the language and statute on that exemption to include railroads and pipeline companies. After that happened, we have litigation that basically, the question before the courts today is, if I am a company and I'm moving my own product, should that be included in this exemption on electricity? And we don't know what the fiscal impact of that is. All we can do is tell you that has not been how it's been interpreted historically. But should the legislature deem that that is appropriate and pass this legislation, obviously we will administer that. But it is important to note that this would provide an exemption that we have not allowed historically, and we are currently with a case at the Supreme Court to clarify this.
Question?
Would stand for questions.
Thank you. Representative Wharf?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess the question I have is, you said railroad and pipelines, and I thought that's what this was. This is people using pipelines. So how are they not covered under that definition already, Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Wharf, pipeline companies, again, our interpretation has been for hire. You hire a pipeline company to transport your product. When the legislature adopted that approach, we did within our Chapter 2 rules of the Department of Revenue provide a definition of pipeline, and I can read that. Pipeline means a system of connected links of large diameter pipes which are used to transport oil, natural gas, and other hydrocarbons over long distances under high pressure to eventually interstate or intrastate customer sales points. A pipeline does not include pipes and other equipment used as part of a gathering system which collects and moves oil, natural gas, or other hydrocarbons from well sites to either a central delivery point, initial storage tank, lease automatic custody transfer, LACT unit, or to the inlet of an interstate or intrastate transmission pipeline. That is pretty much a universal definition for pipeline. So what this bill attempts to do is to expand that definition and include gathering lines included in that pipeline definition so that we've got, and the reason for the regardless of ownership is to ensure that a company moving their own product is able to take advantage of an exemption on the electricity that is used to move that product in addition. I hope that answers your question.
It does, because it was a little confusing to me, because we're talking about two pipelines, but your explanation was adequate to explain that. Thank you.
Representative Campbell?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Director. So I'm interpreting this that we're basically using other people's pipelines to transport. I don't understand how do we differentiate by individual company? To me, this just seems very, very hard to track, because we could have 50 different people using a private pipeline. And so basically that pipeline's giving them a free pass, letting them use their service for free. How do you keep track of all that?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Campbell, we are a self-reporting state. So the manner in which this is administered is that the consumer, the customer that is purchasing the electricity, is providing the public utility with an exemption certificate that is saying these uses are not subject to sales tax, and therefore I'm not paying, I wouldn't be remitting to that public utility the amount of that sales tax. And in turn, the public utility then is not reporting and remitting to the Department of Revenue. The situation that we've got currently is that we have a company that believes that this exemption is applicable to the transport of their own product and has applied to the public utility company for a refund of taxes paid historically. The public utility company then comes to the Department of Revenue and applies for a refund for those dollars so that they can refund the client, or the customer. We've denied that refund because we don't believe that there's an exemption that exists on the books today for a company that's transporting their own product. However, what this bill does is to address that situation and make it clear that regardless of the ownership of the product that's being transported, that a pipeline includes all of their gathering lines, everything that they're using to transport their own product should also be exempt from paying sales tax on the electricity that's used to move that product. Our interpretation historically was that it was for hire. Right now, we're in the midst of litigation, but obviously laws can change. And if this were to pass, we would administer it in this manner and allow that exemption on the electricity. I hope that that helps.
Representative Storr?
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Sorry, I obviously need more coffee this morning. Director Hinson, can you tell me, once again, I think you've already said this, but for whom the exemption that currently exists applies and how this bill would change that?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Storr, currently the department administers the exemption that it's the electricity used by pipeline companies and the railroad used to transport the customer's product from point A to point B. That's how it's been administered historically. That's how we're administering it today. However, we do have litigation in that. And I'm hesitant to go into the details of the current litigation, but we do have litigation where a producer interprets the statute to mean that they should be entitled to the exemption on the electricity used to transport their own product from point A to point B. And this bill would codify that.
Representative Wharf?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess if this exemption were to pass, who would be remaining to pay taxes in that list that you read? Could you tell us who, if this passed, who would pay taxes on the use?
Mr. Chairman, so this bill, Representative Wharf, is specific to the mineral industry. So it is, to me, the interpretation of this would be the mineral industry only, that this would be expanded to, in addition to railroads and pipelines that are for hire, basically. And so I'm really struggling to come up with other types of companies, because it could be very broad. If this bill were not limited to just the transportation of mineral producing companies, we all know that every product is being transported. If we use a broad sense of the term, and if I'm going to move my inventory from this spot to this spot, and it takes electricity to move that product, should that be exempt from taxation? And I think that that's where the initial discussion was when the law used to say that that you had to be engaged in the transportation business. That was what the exemption initially stated. We're just going down a different path related to our current litigation as to should taxpayers receive an exemption from paying sales tax on the electricity that they're consuming when moving products. I think it will be interesting because I think that the court decision, so let's say this passed. Legally, the courts have to look at the statutes as they existed at the time that the taxation occurred. And in this instance, that's the statutes that are in place today. So it'll be interesting to see what the courts tell us related to what that exemption was. And then, of course, if this were to pass, then of course we would implement this as of the effective date of July 1, 2025, which could completely be different than this case that we're currently litigating. And I did not intend to get that much into the weeds with our litigation in any way, shape, or form. But that is the challenge that we have at the Department of Revenue administering the legislative intent of exemptions.
Thank you, Chairman. Representative Storr.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Director Henson, see if I can ask this. I'm curious whether the litigant in this case would fall into the category that Representative Lean suggested the bill would help in terms of just the small producers and how we to think about it, recognizing that there wasn't a completely clear definition.
Director Hansen?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Storr, I would consider the litigant a large producer.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We don't have a fiscal note on this bill, given the amount of the insufficient time. Is it possible to give us a range of what this impact might be?
Ms. Hansen?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Storr, we don't, because we just don't have that information. That would be better suited to come from the industries that are paying those electricity bills. We can tell you the amount of the refund for the one producer, but I'm hesitant because, again, we're in litigation, and I don't feel it's appropriate that we share that information.
All right, let's keep this moving. Representative Locke, and then I think Mr. Obermuir came in to speak. So please come on up here. Representative Locke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Committee, and I first want to apologize for the fact that I missed the presentation of my own bill. So I guess I'm on a roll this morning between trying to time between two bills, and I apologize for that and putting you guys behind. That being said, I will probably try to add a little bit to this. You guys probably see it's very simple in terms of what it does, and it really provides that tax exemption to these collection points. And I'm going to give just what I believe is a little bit of history, but I believe that probably more history can be given by Mr. Obermuller here as well, that makes it clear. But my understanding was that the belief was this was an exemption that was believed, at least at one point, whether rightly or wrongly, was believed to be in place. And in the process of us doing some cleanup of some of the tax codes, we put it in a situation where that exemption was then kind of removed, or the changes we made certainly removed it or took it out of these people's hands. And this is an attempt to kind of get that clearly restated and put back in place. So that's what we're trying to do is, in my mind with this bill, the attempt was just trying to restore an exemption that was already there, that we believe at one point was already there. Now, there may be some discussion on interpretation of that, and the department may have a little bit different interpretation, but that was at least the interpretation that I had as I moved this forward. This was an attempt to kind of make it crystal clear that that exemption was there, because there was some discussion on it, but we believed it was. Anyway, that hopefully helps a little bit. I won't belabor it too much more, because I think it was probably explained. As you guys know, it was really targeted at these pipelines, these collection pipelines. I think they're called, I always use the wrong term, but where they're moving these oils, their oil, gas, whatever, to these collection locations where they're shipping them out, piping them to other locations. So it was those smaller collection pipelines is where, again, the perception, the belief was that that exemption was there at one point, and through a series of events, maybe it was kind of removed. We're just trying to restore it. It was what the intent was of the bill.
Thank you. Any questions for Representative Locke? Mr. Obermuller, you can go ahead and state your name for the record, and let's keep this moving as quick as possible.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman, and members of the committee. Really appreciate it, and thanks very much to the chairman for bringing this bill. So I apologize. I was supporting the chairman's bill in the other committee, and so missed the original two along with him. So I apologize if I repeat some things. So, Mr. Chairman, really, it's a pretty simple policy consideration for this committee. And this committee is the right committee to make the policy consideration and decide which way to go. Should the sales tax exemption that applies to other pipelines in Wyoming also apply to the pipelines that go from the wellhead to the larger pipelines, the intermediate points, otherwise known as gathering lines? Okay? So as the director I think pointed out, for many years, the department interpreted statute to say that it shouldn't apply to gathering lines. Then back in, I think it was 2020, maybe 2021, the department did a sales tax audit of the company that we've been talking about that's in question. As part of that audit, the company realized, wait a minute, we think we might actually apply, it might actually extend to us. And so they applied for the refund, and the Department of Revenue said, no, we don't think you apply. So the company appealed to the State Board of Equalization, following the process in place in state law to do that. They won. The SBOE sided with the company 2 times, Mr. Chairman, 2 times. What happened was the department, who doesn't agree with the SBOE's interpretation, then through using this committee and the previous legislature, and then making a rule change, overruled the SBOE and reverted to their interpretation. That's essentially what happened. Now, the determination of tax policy, in my view, rests with this committee and with the legislature, not with that administrative agency. So you heard the director talking about litigation. Of course, it's all litigation related to that one company who discovered this exemption should apply to them, and hence would apply to other companies, every other company all around the state. And you can't, I don't believe you can fault a company for discovering a tax exemption, and that would apply to all of their competitors and peers all around the state. And wanting to proceed with that. So the litigation would say if the court ends up siding with the department, then that would overrule the refunds that the company has already applied for looking backwards. But then the actions of the department in the rule changes also cuts it off prospectively into the future. So looking back and courts are looking back, you all are looking forward. Okay? We don't have influence over the courts. We've made the arguments we've made there, but we're asking you to not cut it off looking forward. So it's a policy consideration, not as much of a technical one as may have seen. So what is that policy consideration, Mr. Chairman? I would argue, and I would have argued had I had the opportunity to in the previous legislature, is that it should extend to these. And just as Exhibit A, let me read to you, and then I'll cut it after that. But let me read to you, this is important, Mr. Vice Chairman, what the department's definition of pipeline is. And you can track along with what's in your bill about what we prefer. The department's definition of pipeline now, that was put in place just this past September, says pipeline means a system of connected lengths of large diameter pipes which are used to transport oil, natural gas, or other hydrocarbons over long distances under high pressure to eventual interstate or intrastate customer sales point. A pipeline does not include pipes and other equipment used as part of a gathering system which collects and moves oil, natural gas, or other hydrocarbons from well sites to essential delivery point, et cetera, et cetera. You understand the contortions you have to go to remove pipelines as an exemption when you have to include that definition that pipelines don't include pipes. It doesn't make any sense, Mr. Chairman. So the two policy considerations that I would ask you to consider is, one, should they extend? I believe they should for two reasons. One, after labor costs, power costs are the most significant cost for oil and gas industry in the state of Wyoming as a single cost for oil and gas. So that's number one. This legislature's tried for many, many years to try to deal with power costs in lots of different ways. And it's still ongoing. You've got bills in front of you this session. However, this is one immediate way that you could assist. Second, companies are in an unequal position in oil and gas companies. In the Powder River Basin, we produce oil and associated gas. Companies that produce associated gas can power their equipment like we're talking about, tax-free. But companies in the Bighorn Basin and other places that don't produce associated gas have to do it using electricity and must pay tax on that. There's an inherent inequality there. So there's a policy position here to be discussed, and Mr. Chairman, I would suggest that it is appropriate to adopt the SBOE's interpretation of legislation rather than the department's. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Happy to take questions.
Representative Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Director. Basically, what I'm seeing of this is just becoming all-encompassing. All we're doing is we're including gathering lines, which is the one missing component from this. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Campbell, that is correct. And let me just clarify. The power that it takes to get the oil or the gas from the ground to the surface, still our responsibility to answer Representative Worf's question about who would still pay. My companies would still pay to get it from underground to the surface, sales tax on that. It's just the surface gathering, the pipes that deliver it to the intermediate point or the pipeline itself.
Representative Storr.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Thank you, Mr. Obermueller, for being here and clarifying a lot on this. I'm curious, we don't have a fiscal note on this, and I'm just wondering whether you have any sense of what that might be or a range.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Storr, it's a great question. I can give you two relatively unsatisfactory answers. The first is the company in question here had hired a third party to study how much electricity it took to get from the below ground to the surface and how much it took to go from the wellhead to the pipe. So they knew the percentages. There's going to have to be a process if this passes in order to companies to do that, number one. Number two, there's another bill in the Senate that hopefully is coming over to see you all that exempts all all electricity consumers from sales tax, everybody who pays it. Homes, businesses, oil and gas, all that, and a complete repeal. The fiscal note on that bill is 44 million total. So this is just very narrow on this one section. So do I know exactly what it is? No, it's somewhere probably substantially south of 44 million.
Any more questions? No more questions? Any other public comment?
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman.
Let's bring the bill back to the dais. What's your pleasure, committee?
Mr. Chairman, I move that we move the bill.
Second.
Moved by Brown, seconded by Campbell. Let's go through the bill. Anybody have amendments on page 1? Page 2? Page 3? No amendments? Question being called. Donna, will you please take roll?
This is a roll call vote on House Bill 311, exemption for transported fuel and power sales amendments. Representative Brown,
Aye.
Representative Campbell,
Aye.
Representative Lean,
Aye.
Representative Lucas.
Aye.
Representative Riggins excused. Representative Storer.
No.
Excuse me, was that a no? Representative Stivar.
Aye.
Representative Worf.
No.
Chairman Locke. Mr. Chairman, we have 6 aye, 2 no, and 1 excused.
Bill is passed. I turn over the committee back to the chairman. Have a nice day.
Okay. Okay, any other committee business, anything else? All right, I think we're at that point. We'll adjourn the meeting.
You got 10 minutes.